In 2021, a research team at the University of Tübingen extracted DNA from a petrous bone pulled from an Etruscan burial site in central Italy. The petrous bone sits deep behind the inner ear, dense enough to preserve genetic material for thousands of years in conditions that would destroy every other biological trace. What the sequencing revealed should have settled one of the ancient world's most enduring mysteries. Instead, it detonated it. For over 2,000 years, scholars, historians, and scientists had argued about where the Etruscans came from. A powerful, sophisticated civilization that dominated Italy centuries before Rome existed, that gave Rome its alphabet, its infrastructure, its spectacle, and arguably its identity. The ancient historian Herodotus had an answer to their origins. Modern science appeared to confirm it. Then ancient DNA arrived, and everything the field thought it knew was not challenged. It was dismantled completely. To understand why the DNA findings matter, you first have to understand what the Etruscans actually were. Not a footnote in the story of Rome. Not a mysterious predecessor culture dimly remembered through borrowed artifacts. A fully realized civilization that dominated the Italian peninsula for centuries, built cities that still exist today, and shaped the empire that would go on to shape the Western world. The scale of what they achieved, and the scale of what Rome absorbed from them, is routinely underestimated. They called themselves the Resena. The Romans called them the Etrusci, and it is from that Latin root that the modern region of Tuscany takes its name. At their peak, which ran from roughly 750 to 400 BCE, they controlled a broad sweep of central western Italy stretching from the Po Valley in the north down through what is now Tuscany and into Campania in the south. This was not marginal territory. This was the most agriculturally productive and mineral-rich land on the peninsula, and the Etruscans knew precisely what to do with it. Their cities were not villages with ambition. Pisa, Bologna, and Capua, places that remain significant population centers today, were originally Etruscan foundations. Within those cities, they constructed paved roads, functioning aqueducts, and sewage systems at a time when Rome was still a collection of mud huts arranged around a marsh. Their architecture featured temples, luxury villas inspired by Hellenic design, and elaborately decorated necropolises built with the same care and engineering precision as the cities of the living. They cremated their dead and later entombed them in chamber graves furnished with weapons, wine vessels, jewelry, and imported goods from across the Mediterranean world. Because the Etruscans were a seafaring people, their trade networks extended across the entire Mediterranean basin, reaching Phoenicia, Greece, North Africa, and the Iberian coast. Etruscan merchants brought back not only physical goods but cultural ones. Greek artistic styles, Eastern luxury practices, and most significantly, the Western Greek alphabet, which the Etruscans adopted as their own writing system. It was through Etruscan hands that the alphabet passed to the Romans, and through Rome that it eventually became the script you are reading right now. Every letter of the modern Western alphabet traces a direct line back through Rome to Etruria. Their military was formidable. In the Villanovan phase of their early history, Etruscan warriors formed the aristocratic core of society, fighting in the heroic individual style common to Iron Age cultures. As contact with Greece deepened, their armies evolved. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan soldiers were fighting in disciplined hoplite phalanxes, organized, armored, and effective enough to expand Etruscan power across the lion's share of the peninsula. They were, for several centuries, the dominant military force in Italy. That dominance extended directly over Rome itself. In 616 BCE, an Etruscan aristocrat from the city of Tarquinia ascended as king of Rome. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus introduced the city to a working sewage system, built the Circus Maximus, imported athletes and chariot racers from Etruria, and began the process of transforming Rome from a provincial backwater into something approaching an urban center. His dynasty lasted 2 more generations. When his grandson Tarquinius Superbus was finally overthrown in 509 BCE, the Roman Republic was born. But the Etruscan imprint on the city was already permanent. The Romans took the toga from the Etruscans. They took the fasces, the bundle of rods, symbolizing authority that Roman magistrates carried in public. They took the custom of the military triumph. They took the brass trumpet used to relay orders in battle, the pilum and the scutum, the javelin and the shield that defined the Roman legionary, both evolved from Etruscan designs. Some sources trace the institution of gladiatorial combat itself back to an Etruscan sacrificial rite. The Romans were not embarrassed by this inheritance. They simply stopped mentioning it. Politically, the Etruscans were organized around city-states, fiercely independent and frequently at war with one another, bound together loosely by the League of 12 Peoples, a confederation that regulated shared religious and economic interests without ever achieving genuine political unity. That inability to unite would ultimately cost them everything. But for centuries before Rome found its strength, the Ravenna were the power in Italy. Understanding that is not background context. It is the foundation on which everything the DNA revealed becomes truly astonishing. Of all the questions the ancient world left unanswered, the origin of the Etruscans ranked among the most persistently debated. It was not simply an academic puzzle. It was a civilizational enigma that troubled historians, linguists, and archaeologists for over 2,000 years, and the reason it proved so resistant to resolution comes down to a single extraordinary fact. The Etruscan language does not belong to any known language family on Earth. Every people surrounding the Etruscans spoke an Indo-European language. To their north, the Celtic Gauls. To their south, the Greeks. To their east, the Italic tribes, who would eventually produce the Latins of Rome. These languages, diverse as they sound to modern ears, share a common ancestor, a proto-language spoken by populations that migrated out of the Caucasian steppe region somewhere between the 3rd and 1st millennium BCE, spreading westward across Europe and carrying their linguistic inheritance with them. Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Sanskrit. The family tree is vast, and it covers most of the globe today. Etruscan is not on that tree. It is not related to any of its neighbors. It is not related to any other known language in the ancient world with any certainty. Linguists have spent decades attempting to decode it fully, and while they can read individual words and reconstruct basic grammatical structures from the roughly 10,000 surviving inscriptions, a complete understanding of the language remains out of reach. It stands alone, an anomaly surrounded on all sides by languages that share deep common roots, and that isolation is precisely what made the origin question so compelling and so difficult. 3 competing theories dominated the debate for centuries. The oldest and most famous came from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE. He claimed the Etruscans were migrants from Lydia, a kingdom on the western coast of modern Turkey in Anatolia. According to Herodotus, a prolonged famine had forced the Lydian king to send half his population westward by ship, and those migrants eventually landed on the Italian coast and became the Ravenna. It was a clean narrative, geographically plausible for the ancient world, and it came with the authority of the father of history behind it. The second theory argued for indigenous origin. If the Etruscan language bore no relationship to the Indo-European languages carried into Europe by steppe migrants, perhaps that was because the Etruscans predated those migrations entirely. Perhaps they were the remnant of a far older European population, people who had inhabited the peninsula since before the great linguistic transformation of the Bronze Age, preserving in their language a trace of what Europe sounded like before the steppe arrivals rewrote it. This theory had a quiet elegance. It positioned the Etruscans not as mysterious arrivals, but as survivors, the last clear echo of a world that the Indo-European expansion had otherwise erased. A third theory, largely discredited but persistent in older literature, proposed a northern origin, suggesting the Etruscans had descended into Italy from beyond the Alps. This found little traction because it explained neither the language anomaly nor the archaeological evidence, and it faded gradually from serious, scholarly discussion. The contest that remained was between Herodotus and the indigenists, and for most of recorded history, neither side could produce the kind of evidence that would settle it definitively. Without that evidence, the debate generated enormous heat and very little light. Written records were too sparse and too late. Archaeological artifacts could demonstrate cultural contact, but not population origin. Artistic styles could be borrowed, religious practices adopted, burial customs transferred across ethnic boundaries without a single migrant crossing the sea. Every piece of evidence the field produced was compatible with more than one interpretation, and so the argument continued. Decade after decade, century after century, the Etruscans remaining stubbornly opaque about their own beginnings. What nobody seriously confronted was how much the entire debate rested on an assumption so foundational it was almost invisible. The assumption that origin and identity were the same thing, that knowing where a people came from would explain what made them who they were. It felt like the right question because it felt like the complete question. Find the homeland, trace the migration, close the file. When the technology finally arrived that could test the competing theories directly, the result did not close the file. It revealed that the file had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. For most of the 20th century, the tools available to researchers trying to solve the Etruscan question were blunt instruments applied to a problem that required surgical precision. Population genetics existed, but it could only work with what was available, and what was available was the living. Researchers took blood samples from modern Italians, mapped genetic marker frequencies across different regions, and attempted to reason backward through time toward ancient population origins. It was a method with genuine scientific value in other contexts. For this particular question, it was fundamentally compromised from the start. The core problem is one that sounds technical, but is actually straightforward once you see it. Working only from modern genetic samples, you cannot distinguish between two completely different histories that happen to produce similar endpoints. A population that remained in place and largely undisturbed for 3,000 years looks nearly identical at the genetic level to a population that was replaced twice over but landed in a similar frequency range by the end of the process. When all you have is the final result, the intermediate steps are invisible. You are trying to reconstruct a journey from a single photograph of the destination, and the photograph does not tell you how many roads were taken to get there. Early mitochondrial DNA studies compounded the confusion rather than resolving it. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child along the unbroken maternal line, was for a long time the most accessible form of ancient genetic material because it survives in higher quantities than nuclear DNA and is easier to extract from degraded remains. Researchers seized on it as a window into population history. The problem is that it is an extraordinarily narrow window. It traces one single thread of ancestry, the mother's 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 line stretching back through time, and ignores everything carried by every father in the chain. It captures perhaps 2 or 3% of the genetic story and misses the rest entirely. Using mitochondrial DNA to reconstruct where a population came from is like trying to understand the full demographic history of an entire city by interviewing one person per household and restricting every question to their mother's side of the family. You might catch a real signal buried in the data, but you are operating with such a narrow aperture that the signal you catch could be misleading, amplified beyond its true significance simply because everything else is invisible to your instrument. In 2007, a study comparing mitochondrial DNA from modern Tuscans to ancient Anatolian populations found what appeared to be a striking genetic match. The maternal lineages of people living in Tuscany today showed measurable similarity to populations from Western Turkey. For a field that had been searching for exactly this kind of evidence, the finding felt decisive. Herodotus had claimed the Etruscans came from Lydia in Anatolia. Now the DNA seemed to confirm it. The result moved quickly through popular science media. The father of history had been vindicated. The Etruscans were Anatolian migrants. Case closed. Except it was not closed. What the 2007 study had actually captured was a maternal line, similarity between two modern populations, a similarity that could reflect ancient migration but could equally reflect later movements, shared Neolithic ancestry, or the simple statistical noise that emerges when you compare populations using a fragment of the genome and treat the result as representative of the whole. The study's conclusion was not wrong because its data was fabricated. It was wrong because the tool was insufficient for the claim being made, and because the field was primed to find confirmation of the Herodotus theory and interpreted an ambiguous signal as definitive proof. That is how the false consensus held. Not through dishonesty, but through the natural human tendency to treat the first plausible answer as the final one, particularly when it confirms what the oldest and most authoritative source already suggested. For a generation of researchers and documentaries and popular histories, the Etruscan origin question was considered resolved. Herodotus was right. The mtDNA said so. What nobody was yet asking was what whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA pulled directly from Etruscan burial sites might reveal. The petrous bone, that extraordinarily dense fragment lodged behind the inner ear, capable of preserving usable genetic material for 10,000 years in Mediterranean conditions that would normally degrade DNA within centuries, was about to provide an answer. And that answer would not refine the Anatolian theory, it would erase it. In 2021, an international research team led by Cosimo Post at the University of Tübingen published a study that the field had been building toward for years. The methodology was precise, and the sample set was the largest ever assembled for ancient Etruscan genomic research. 82 ancient genomes drawn from 12 archaeological sites across Etruria and southern Italy, spanning nearly 2 millennia of continuous burial evidence from 800 BCE through to 1000 AD. The researchers were not guessing. They were reading the actual DNA of people who had lived, worked, and died inside Etruscan civilization, extracted from petrous bones preserved in necropolises that had sat undisturbed for centuries. The team went in expecting to find the Eastern Mediterranean genetic signal that Herodotus had described, and that the 2007 mitochondrial study appeared to confirm. Some ancestral thread connecting the Etruscan genome back to Lydia, to Anatolia, to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, a migration encoded in the biology of the people themselves, invisible to archaeology and linguistics, but readable in the genome if you looked with the right instrument. This was the result the field had been primed to find. It was not the result the data produced. The Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from the Latins living in nearby Rome. Same proportion of steppe ancestry, same Neolithic farmer foundation, same overall genomic profile. Not similar, not approximately aligned, indistinguishable. Post told Science magazine directly that the Etruscans looked like their Latin neighbors at the genomic level, a statement that carried the full weight of 82 sequenced individuals behind it. The Eastern Mediterranean signal the researchers had been looking for was not present in the Etruscan genome in any form that would support an Anatolian migration. The Herodotus theory was not weakened or complicated by this finding. It was demolished. Let that settle for a moment. Two civilizations separated by a completely different language, distinct religious practices, entirely different artistic traditions, and different burial customs, carrying virtually identical DNA. The people who spoke the great unsolvable language of ancient Italy were, at the genomic level, the same people as their Latin-speaking neighbors. The mystery that had haunted researchers since antiquity, the question Herodotus had answered with a migration story and 2,000 years of scholarship had debated without resolution, turned out to have an answer that nobody in the field had seriously predicted. The Etruscans were not from somewhere else. They were already there. But the finding did not close the mystery, it deepened it. Because if the Etruscans carried significant steppe ancestry, and steppe ancestry correlates across the entire European continent with the spread of Indo-European languages, why did the Etruscans speak something that was emphatically, irreducibly non-Indo-European? Every other population across Europe that absorbed comparable levels of steppe ancestry ended up speaking a language from the Indo-European family. The Celts, the Italic peoples, the Germanic tribes, the Greeks, The connection between steppe migration and Indo-European language spread is one of the most robust findings in the entire field of ancient DNA research. The Etruscans were the exception that refused to resolve. David Caramelli at the University of Florence offered the most compelling explanation available. The Etruscan language predated the steppe arrivals and proved resilient enough to survive the genetic turnover. New populations moving into Etruria over centuries did not overwrite the existing culture. They were absorbed into it. Genes changed. Language persisted. The biological identity of the Etruscan population was gradually transformed by incoming migrations, while the cultural identity held firm around a linguistic core old enough and deeply enough embedded to outlast the people who had originally spoken it. That explanation is plausible. It may even be correct. But it carries an implication that cuts directly through decades of population history and makes an uncomfortable point with extraordinary sharpness. The assumption that genetic ancestry predicts cultural identity, that knowing where a people's DNA came from tells you what language they spoke and what kind of civilization they built, is not just occasionally unreliable. In the Etruscan case, it is so thoroughly wrong that it misled the entire field for decades and turned a mitochondrial coincidence into a headline. The 2007 study now stands as a precise illustration of what happens when researchers construct a grand narrative on a single thin strand of evidence and treat it as the whole rope. The Etruscans did not come from Anatolia. They were already there, and what replaced them genetically left their language, for a time, completely intact. That is not the answer the field expected. It is the only answer the evidence supports. To fully understand what the Etruscan DNA finding means, you have to place it inside a much larger story. Not the story of one civilization and its disputed origins, but the story of an entire peninsula accumulated across 12,000 years of human movement. Because the Etruscans did not appear on a blank genetic canvas. They emerged from a sequence of population transformations so dramatic and so complete that by the time the first Etruscan city was being built, the land beneath it had already been genetically rewritten twice over. Modern humans reached the Italian peninsula roughly 45,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets buried much of northern Europe under kilometers of frozen silence, Italy functioned as one of the great refugia, places where small bands of hunter-gatherers survived conditions brutal enough to empty the rest of the continent. When temperatures finally rose and the ice retreated, it was partly from these Italian refugia that human populations expanded northward again, recolonizing a Europe that the cold had cleared. These were the peninsula's original inhabitants, foragers shaped across tens of thousands of years by its coastlines, its river valleys, its particular rhythms of survival. Their genetic signature was the foundation on which everything that followed would be built. Then, around 8,000 years ago, the first transformation arrived. Neolithic farmers, originating from Anatolia and the Near East, crossed the Mediterranean and began spreading across the Italian peninsula. This was not a gradual cultural exchange between neighboring peoples who slowly adopted each other's practices. Across Europe, the farming transition involved a near total replacement of indigenous forager populations by incoming agricultural communities, and Italy was no exception. The earliest farming sites appear in Puglia on the southeastern coast, and from there the agricultural frontier spread northward along the Adriatic and westward toward the Tyrrhenian coast with a speed that the genetic record captures with uncomfortable clarity. Within a few centuries, the genetic signature of Italy's original hunter-gatherers had been reduced to a minority component, typically somewhere between 15 and 25% of the genome. A population that had survived an ice age that had outlasted conditions capable of wiping out most of human Europe was genetically overwhelmed not by warfare or catastrophe, but by the slow, relentless arithmetic of farming communities outbreeding foraging ones. Numbers and fertility rates, not violence, rewrote the peninsula's biological identity for the first time. One place was largely spared. Sardinia, difficult to reach by sea and far enough from the mainland to escape the constant reshuffling of coastal populations, was bypassed by most of what followed. Modern Sardinians remain to this day the closest living Europeans to those original Neolithic farmers, a genetic time capsule surrounded by deep water, preserving in their DNA a portrait of what early European farmers looked like before the next wave arrived and changed everything again, because another wave was already coming. The second transformation arrived during the Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago, when populations carrying ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea, began moving into Europe in one of the largest migrations in human prehistory. These were mobile pastoralists who herded cattle, worked bronze, rode horses, and spoke the ancestor of nearly every European language alive today. Their genetic fingerprint spread across the continent with extraordinary speed, and Italy was not insulated from it. Steppe-related ancestry reached northern Italy by approximately 2000 BCE and had penetrated into central Italy by around 1600 BCE, carried in part by the Bell-Beaker cultural complex, a widespread archaeological phenomenon associated with distinctive pottery, metalwork, and, as ancient DNA now confirms, a very specific genetic profile. By the time the earliest Etruscan cities were beginning to take shape, Central Italians already carried roughly 30% steppe ancestry. The people who would become the Etruscans had been transformed twice before their civilization produced a single bronze artifact or carved a single tomb inscription. This is what makes the 2021 finding so significant when you hold it against the full sequence. The Etruscans were not a genetic anomaly. They were not mysterious outsiders carrying a foreign biological signature into an otherwise coherent population. They were the product of the same layered prehistoric migrations that had shaped the Latins, the Italic tribes, and every other people on the peninsula. The Iron Age Italian peninsula was culturally fragmented to an extraordinary degree, multiple languages, multiple religious systems, multiple artistic traditions existing in close proximity. But underneath all of that cultural diversity, the genomic evidence reveals something the ancient sources never recorded. It was largely one people, shaped by the same ancient forces, carrying the same deep layers of forager, farmer, and steppe ancestry beneath strikingly different surfaces. The Etruscans were absorbed into Rome gradually, and then completely. By 264 BCE, the last Etruscan city had fallen. By around 30 AD, the Etruscan language had gone extinct. But the story of what ancient DNA reveals about the Italian peninsula does not end with the Etruscans. It accelerates because what happened to the genetic identity of Rome during the Imperial period is, by any measure, the most dramatic finding in the entire dataset, and it reframes everything that came before it in ways the field is still working through. During the Imperial period, beginning around the 1st century AD, the genetic profile of people buried in and around Rome underwent a transformation so profound that it registered as one of the largest ancestry shifts documented in European history outside of the original Neolithic transition. Post's team quantified it at approximately 50% admixture with Eastern Mediterranean populations. A separate study led by Margaret Antonio and Jonathan Pritchard at Stanford, analyzing 127 ancient genomes drawn from 29 archaeological sites in and around Rome across 12,000 years of continuous habitation, captured the same signal independently. People interred in Imperial-era Rome looked genetically less like their own Iron Age predecessors, and more like contemporaries living in Syria, Lebanon, and Western Anatolia. The city that built the Colosseum, codified Roman law, and constructed the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had ever produced was, in biological terms, as Near Eastern as it was European. The mechanism was the empire itself. At its peak, Rome controlled territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, governing roughly 70 million people. Slaves poured into the capital from the eastern provinces. So did freed people, merchants, soldiers completing their service, administrators, and craftsmen drawn by opportunity in the largest city in the Western world. The eastern Mediterranean was far more densely populated than Gaul, Hispania, or Britannia, and the net demographic flow ran consistently westward toward Rome. This was not a trickle spread across centuries. The genetic data suggests it was rapid enough to reshape the city's ancestry profile within a few generations. Rome did not merely conquer the East moved to Rome. A 2025 study published in Genome Biology and Evolution by researchers at Oxford pushed the timeline back even further, finding that the Eastern Mediterranean genetic signal was already appearing in Central Italian individuals dated to the late Republican period. Roughly 200 years before the empire formally began under Augustus. The shift was underway during the Punic Wars, during the conquest of Greece, during the annexation of the eastern provinces. Ancient DNA was tracking Roman military and economic expansion more precisely than any surviving historical text. The Romans built an eternal city. They did not build an eternal people. And when the empire finally collapsed, another wave was already forming beyond the Alps. In 568 AD, the Lombards crossed from Pannonia into northern Italy, beginning a conquest that reshaped the political and, as ancient DNA confirms, the genetic landscape of the peninsula for centuries. Historians had long debated whether the Lombard arrival represented a genuine mass migration or simply a change of rulers. Ancient DNA settled that debate. A 2018 study published in Nature Communications analyzed Lombard burials in both Hungary and Italy and found strong genetic similarities between the two groups, confirming that this was a genuine folk migration, families included, not merely soldiers and commanders relocating across the Alps. These were not Italians with Germanic rulers. These were Germanic people who became Italians over generations. But the Lombards did not reach everywhere. They never took Sardinia. They never fully controlled Sicily, Calabria, or coastal Puglia, regions that remained under Byzantine governance and maintained their deep connections to the Eastern Mediterranean world. That uneven coverage carved a genetic fault line directly through the Italian peninsula, one whose traces remain measurable in modern DNA today. When researchers mapped the genetic structure of 1,616 modern Italians, drawn from all 20 administrative regions in a 2019 study published in Science Advances, 3 distinct clusters emerged with clarity. Northern Italy clustered with Spaniards and Southern French. Southern Italy clustered closest to modern Greeks. And Sardinia stood entirely apart from both, preserving a genetic profile closer to Stone Age farmers than to almost anyone else alive in Europe today. The genetic distance between a Milanese and a Sicilian is modest in absolute terms, but it maps precisely onto 12,000 years of differential migration history, layer by layer, wave by wave, conquest by conquest. The Etruscans were one layer among many, extraordinary in what they built. Indistinguishable, it turns out, in their blood from the people they were supposed to be nothing like. Return to that petrous bone extracted from an Etruscan necropolis. Inside it, preserved across 2,500 years, was the answer to a question that had defeated historians, linguists, and scientists since antiquity. The Etruscans were not Anatolian migrants. They were not mysterious outsiders carrying a foreign identity into an otherwise coherent world. They were already there, shaped by the same ancient migrations that had built everyone around them, and what made them extraordinary was never encoded in their DNA. It was expressed in what they built with it. The cities, the trade networks, the alphabet that became Rome's alphabet that became ours. If the most studied pre-Roman civilization in Italy carried a completely different origin story than 2,000 years of scholarship assumed, the question that remains is not about the Etruscans. It is about every origin story every civilization has ever told about itself. The next petrous bone will have something to say about that.